Who's the FNG? Ooh, he's our new DevOps onboarding integration specialist. So what's he gonna do? I don't really know. I just heard on a podcast that we needed one. Is that where he's gonna sit? Yeah, is that a problem? No, it's fine. That's where I normally curl up in the fetal position and cry during my breaks, but whatever, don't worry about it. One of the questions I get asked a lot is how do I build a DevOps team? And for me, I kind of think that's the wrong question to ask. It's not how do you build one, it's why do you want one and do you need one? And so whenever I ask that question back to whoever's asking me that, a lot of times their response is, well, I need a DevOps team to do the DevOps stuff, right? It's kind of a no-brainer. Sort of. But there's actually this saying over in like the DevOps community that DevOps is how we do things, not who does them. And so I think in order for that to make sense to someone just getting started in DevOps, you have to understand like how DevOps came to be to begin with. So we'll do a bit of a history lesson here. I'll try to make it entertaining. But then after that, I'll tell you why, or I'll give you some solutions that I think will work better for you than focusing on building a DevOps team for the sake of having a DevOps team, possibly. So let's go back in time, back before we had DevOps, and you kind of had two different organizations. You had the software engineering team and you had the IT team. And so the software team would build their code and then they would throw it over the wall to the IT team to deploy and manage that application. And a lot of times that was done without, any, there was documentation, but there wasn't really like a clear set of operating guidelines of how do you make this thing that you gave me scale and grow and be performant. And in that scenario, you can't really blame the software team or the IT team directly. The failure was a failure of communication, right? Because the software team should have better communicated how this application was meant to be deployed, scaled, and built. And they also, at the same time, should have written the code in a way that was built to run on the infrastructure that the IT team had to work with. And so the IT team themselves, they should have done a better job of giving guidelines on what infrastructure they had available to run code on, and then offering feedback on how the application deployment and operation process was going so that the two teams could learn from what each other had to offer and how to do better in the long run. And that was kind of the core problem, that there was this lack of communication, and communication was really the root cause there. You had these two teams, but they weren't communicating. And when I say they weren't communicating, like, it wasn't that they weren't meeting. There were meetings. Holy shit, there were so many frickin' meetings. But the meetings just weren't effective. The right questions weren't being asked. And that's really important, right? Like, you've got to, if you're going to go into a meeting with someone, you've got to know the right questions to ask, and you've got to spend a good amount of time listening and understand what's not being said so that you can ask the questions to uncover the things that you didn't even know were important. And actually, I've got a video, I'll link to it up here, on gathering requirements that goes into that in quite a bit of detail if you want to check that out. And so that's why I say that you probably don't need a DevOps team on the surface, because if you build a DevOps team for the sake of having a DevOps team, really you've just recreated the problem that DevOps was trying to solve. And there's a good chance you might have actually made the problem worse, because now if you have If before you had a software engineering team and an IT team, and then you introduce a DevOps team to it as well, so you went from 2 teams that weren't communicating to now you've got 3 teams that aren't communicating. So, you didn't really solve the problem at all. So what do you do instead? Well, I think that the right reason or the right answer to that is not to build a DevOps team, but to grow the DevOps skills for the existing teams that you have. And since we're talking about DevOps for developers, you might pick up on the fact that that is the exact reason I started this channel, right? Is to help developers add DevOps skills to their existing skill set. And the number one skill that you need to succeed in DevOps is communication, right? And communication doesn't mean talking. It means a lot of listening and a lot of asking questions to the things that people are telling you to find out the things that they didn't tell you about. Because when you enter into any conversation, you have certain assumptions like, oh, this person works at this company. Surely they know fact X. Well, if you don't know fact X, then you don't know to ask about that. And that's where a lot of communication breaks down. So without a doubt, you do need a lot of different technical skills to succeed in DevOps. But here's the magic box to that is you're never going to master them all, right? There are so many skills that if you were to go out and master them all, by the time you finish mastering them, there would be new skills and some of the existing skills would change. So you'd have to go back and relearn those. So the idea of having this DevOps person who's a master of DevOps is just not really feasible. I think the better way to approach this is to have DevOps skills along with your existing skill set. And the primary skill is communication, because through effective communication, you can learn the technical constraints of building, scaling, and deploying your application. And then once you know those constraints, you'll have a better idea of what is going to be successful for your application and your project. And then if that turns into a technical skill set that you don't have, you can go learn that technical skill set. And so the real hidden benefit to that is, like, instead of learning DevOps skills for the sake of learning DevOps skills, you learn what DevOps skills are going to be successful in your exact environment, and then you focus in on those. And once you know the technical skills that you need, like, there's tons of content out there to go get it. There's just so many resources available. The hard part is knowing which ones are relevant to you. And so if you have this dedicated DevOps team, you're still not going to know which ones are necessary for you. And you really need, like, that knowledge transfer into your engineering team, right? Because as you engineer code, you've got to write the code in such a way that it runs on the infrastructure it's going to be deployed on. So let me actually give you a real world scenario to kind of illustrate that better. So let's say you're starting a new project, and so your team gets together to start laying out the project requirements, and everyone on the team is really leaning towards doing something that kind of runs on serverless. Everyone's excited about serverless, so you want to do that. And as you start having that conversation, someone on your team who's worked with your IT team in the past points out that because of some regulatory requirements around this application, it's going to have to be hosted in one of the physical data centers where they don't have anything serverless available. There's just no such thing as serverless in this data center. So you can't really use serverless for this application. So now your team regroups and figures out that they're going to build the application around Docker and use Docker as the virtualization service for your application, and problem solved, right? Well, it seems really, really simple. Oh, we don't have this, so we'll do this instead. And it seems really, really simple to the point of, like, why are you even bothering to point this out? Until we go through what the alternate path would have been without that person who had DevOps skills on your team. So without that person speaking up to say, hey, you don't have that option here, what would have ended up happening is your team would have built this serverless solution or this serverless application, handed it over to IT, who would have just stared at it with dumb looks on their face and said, there's no way we can run this. But now you're at your project deadline, so they turn the project back to you, and you're faced with a couple of options, and both of those options are going to cost you a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money and a huge amount of embarrassment because your project's late. But let's talk about option number one first. Option number one is you re-architect your project to work on the infrastructure that IT has available in that data center. But now because your project is already late, you're going to be getting a lot of pressure to rush that through, which I'm not going to say you're going to cut corners, but I am going to say that it's going to be rushed, and it may not lead to the finished, final, polished product that your team's capable of delivering. And eventually that can lead to, maintenance problems down the road. It could result in code that's difficult to maintain or an application that's difficult to scale and all sorts of problems like that. The other solution, and don't laugh when I say this because I've actually seen this multiple times. The other solution is instead of giving it to your IT team to deploy and manage, you go off and you set up your own hosting service, whether it's AWS or Azure or whoever, and you build and deploy and host the application out there without your IT team. And that comes with its own set of problems because now you've got this rogue application and you've got to address, who owns the security of this, who provisions and deprovisions access to it, who's responsible for doing the maintenance and the patches and the updates and all of these things that IT normally takes care of for you that your team isn't staffed or equipped with the personnel to do on your own. And then eventually this rogue environment's going to get discovered anyway, and that's going to create another huge problem of what do you do with that? Do you tear it all down and migrate your application to the original data center or to a different data center that's supported by IT? Or do you give it to IT and have them try to figure out how to wrangle it into their supported infrastructure? And it just leads to a ton of problems like that. So that's why I point out that, like, in the meeting, having someone who's knowledgeable and works closely with the infrastructure services that are available with a 60-second conversation can circumvent months of pain and frustration from doing things the wrong way. And that's the real benefit of, instead of having a DevOps team, having DevOps inside of your team, giving those DevOps skills to the people on your team so that as those conversations happen on a day-to-day basis, you identify and resolve those problems before they ever have the opportunity to become problems. So let's recap. No, you don't need a DevOps team. What you need are individuals on your software and IT teams with DevOps skills who routinely work together and collaborate together throughout all stages of the software development lifecycle. And then over time, you'll identify the specific DevOps technical skills that are needed by your team and your company, and then you'll learn those and you'll share those across your team, which gives you, in the long run, it gives you a fault-tolerant, highly redundant engineering team within your organization.